Seasons 1 and 2 of Drugs on the Docket aim to shed light on a variety of federal and state drug-related cases and topics. And if one thing has become clear, it's that the administration and enforcement of drug laws is anything but cut and dry. And nowhere is this more evident than on college campuses, spaces where students of both legal and underage status engage in the consumption of legal and illicit substances, and whose conduct is subject to overlapping authorities at the federal, state, local, and campus levels. At a time when more and more states vote to legalize adult use and medical use of marijuana, and even consider legalization of other substances illegal under federal law, navigating these layered, conflicting policies becomes more and more challenging. From the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University, this is Drugs on the Docket. Each episode will tell the story of how U.S. court decisions impact drug law and policy and continue to shape the war on drugs. I'm your host, Hannah Miller. In this episode, we sit down with colleagues at the Ohio State University Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse, Prevention, and Recovery to better understand the relationship between federal and campus drug policies. If you like what you hear in today's episode, visit go.osu.edu/drugs on the docket to follow the series. So for the first time ever, we've got two non-attorneys taking the reins of Drugs on the Docket. I'm joined today by Logan Davis, an Outreach and Engagement Manager for The Ohio State University's Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse, Prevention, and Recovery. Whew, long name. Welcome to the podcast, Logan.
Yeah, Hannah, and I will give you a couple seconds to breathe after that long title, but so excited to be with you today.
And HECAOD is the way that you shorten that?
Yeah. So HECAOD, or we've even heard people pronounce it HECAOD.
We called the Drug Enforcement Policy Center DEPIC, so I can totally understand the acronym. You and I have very similar roles at our respective centers, and we brought together our bosses, the executive directors of HECAOD and DEPIC. It feels like a Parent Trap situation, minus the youthful hijinks, plus academic and practitioner discourse. I don't think this would sell as an entertainment or movie plot, but with that, would you do the honor of introducing the first of our guests?
Absolutely. So excited to introduce Dr. Jim Lange. He's the executive director of the Higher Ed Center, which is an academic center at Ohio State with partnerships between the OSU College of Pharmacy and the Office of Student Life. However, Jim does not get to live in beautiful Ohio. Jim has the unfortunate ability to live in San Diego, where he works at San Diego State University as the coordinator of alcohol and other drugs. He's been there over 20 years. He has worked in the field of higher education prevention and researched alcohol and other drugs for over 25 years. Jim, I believe you've been credited with over 70 peer-reviewed scholarly publications and have over 200 conference presentations. Jim, so excited to have your expertise as a part of this conversation. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Logan. And you're welcome to Grin and Barrett here in San Diego anytime.
That was such a wonderful introduction to Jim and all of his accomplishments. I'm just going to say that joining us on our side is Doug Berman. He's the executive director of DEPIC. Doug, you've been replaced by Logan and you're in the hot seat. How does that feel?
It is so cool to be in the hot seat, and thank you for coordinating all of this to all of you involved. And I know, Hannah, rather than worry about my introduction, you were booking travel to San Diego as we were getting started. So thank you, and thanks again to bring us all together to talk about these issues at an interesting time.
So DEPIC's research has not focused much on how drug policy and criminalization of drugs impacts university students and employees. So I'd love to get a little more context first from Jim about the intersection of these two topics. When did drug prevention and recovery become a priority for universities?
It mostly became a priority with the Drug-Free Schools and Community Act, a federal law that requires all institutions of higher education to have a alcohol and drug prevention program. It followed some big changes in alcohol laws and also some with some respect drug laws in the 80s as the uniform age 21 law went across with Ronald Reagan's administration and really the push that MAD had on doing something around drunk driving. There was evidence that showed that the difference in age of alcohol use was determining the rate of impaired driving crashes and deaths. So making that uniform was important. But one of the things that people started noticing was that as states changed their laws, drunk driving went down as they raised the age. But amongst college students, it wasn't changing. And it appeared that colleges were an island of not addressing alcohol and drugs. It was sort of a safe space for those youths. And so that was some of the context of having colleges and universities required to abide by the local laws, enforce them, and have a prevention program.
And since then, has prevention and recovery evolved? Like since the height of the war on drugs, which I imagine the war on drugs and the Reagan administration's role in that likely played into the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. Would you say that that was the case?
It was important to see that sort of war on drugs concept that was happening, but a lot came a little bit later than that, in the 90s, when the Department of Ed and also NIH started becoming more proactive in not just having the sort of compliance component, but efficacy component. What can campuses do that actually work? And so that was through some grant programs that Department of Ed had, and also some initiatives that NIAAA had helped spur a research boom in sense on college student drinking, not as much on drug use, because the most common drug that college students take is alcohol. And so a lot was learned in those decades. And then it became more a process of trying to get campuses to use evidence-based and effective programs.
The center that I work for provides record relief services because criminal records continue to hinder individuals well after they've paid their due to society. Criminal records restrict housing, personal and professional opportunities because most employers and landlords run criminal background checks, but background checks are not just for housing and the labor market. Another way in which criminal records impact individuals is restricting access to public benefits like federal student aid. So it's interesting to hear that there was a federal law employed to at least curb use maybe on campus, but then also the fact that there were individuals who might want to take advantage of federal aid being prevented from gaining access to that to then join these college campuses. I read recently, though, that the FAFSA Simplification Act in 2021 that resulted in a major federal policy change for college applicants. So college students who have drug-related convictions or obtain them while they are enrolled, their student aid is not in jeopardy the way it was maybe like 10 or 20 years ago. So can you discuss this development and whether this policy change has affected university prevention and recovery programming in any way?
I haven't heard much in terms of programming changes with that. There are some important things campuses must do, including list out the consequences of illegal use of drugs. That has to be part of their Drug-Free Schools and Community Act compliance. And since that has changed, it's important for campuses to look at their language. But in terms of how prevention works on campus, I don't think it's changed that much other than some messaging where people would talk about the risk they may be taking if they use federal aid. But that wasn't really a component of very many campuses' prevention programs as far as I'm aware.
I want to remove campuses from the equation and plug Doug into this conversation because of his expertise with just marijuana laws federally and then marijuana laws in states where it's either illegal or it's been legalized in recent years. Doug, you want to go ahead and just kind of give us an overview?
I assume many people are familiar with the way in which at the state level, marijuana prohibition has turned into marijuana partial legalization in a number of states for medical marijuana and then ultimately full legalization at the state level. That's all been against the backdrop of still federal prohibition and somewhat building off Jim's reminder that we shifted towards the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act in the wake of alcohol age limits moving up to 21. Similarly, we have had in all of this legalization movement, 21 set as the age for legal access for full recreational marijuana. Most of that state level reform, not all of it, but most of it took place through direct democracy, through ballot initiatives being endorsed by a majority of voters in a series of states. This really gets kicked off already almost 30 years ago now with California in 1996 being the first medical marijuana state, but then medical marijuana sort of marching forward in a number of states and then turned to recreational marijuana now already a full dozen years ago with Colorado and Washington then being the vanguard of going for full legalization. And so that's been the sort of long-term story. I might shift to the short-term story about what we saw in 2024, because there's arguably a changing narrative, though I'm not sure it's exactly a changing reality in the politics, as more and more states over time legalized both medical and recreational marijuana. That, not surprisingly, saw its foundation in more progressive states, California, Washington, Colorado being kind of highlights of that. And that's because, especially out west, but even across the country, the advocates for marijuana reform recognized that more progressive states would be more likely to vote in favor. And so there was a targeting of those states as the vanguard of these efforts. Over time, we saw greater and greater efforts to go to more what you sometimes call purple states or even red states. I'm still here in Ohio, and in Ohio, it was 2023 that actually had a ballot initiative on full legalization of marijuana, and that passed with 57% support. But as the kind of move towards more conservative states became the focal point for advocates, the votes weren't as consistently in favor as they were in the early years. And so we saw votes in states like Oklahoma and in the Dakotas not get to that approval stage, though sometimes it would take multiple efforts for a state to legalize. California actually rejected in 2010 a full legalization initiative before they moved forward in 2016. Arizona likewise needed two rounds before full legalization hit there. And so it's not unusual to see an initial rejection even in a progressive state. But as we've seen the red states push back a bit more, have less support for full legalization, we've seen the Dakotas vote multiple times against legalization, and they did so again in 2024, where both South Dakota and North Dakota rejected ballot initiatives for full legalization. The one that's really interesting, I think, from a kind of a messaging reality, what is the truth, is Florida had a big legalization campaign in 2024. However, it didn't pass, not because there wasn't majority voter support. 56% of Floridians voted in favor of marijuana legalization, but under Florida law, you need 60% to pass a constitutional initiative. And so it failed, but failed with, somewhat ironically, the exact same level of support that winning ballot initiative had in Colorado, had in California, had in Massachusetts, had in a bunch of other blue states. And so it seems like when you get to the voters in most states, not all, but most states, you're getting about a 55% support level. That's been enough to pass a lot of initiatives, but wasn't enough in Florida. The other kind of trend that also saw a real interesting turn has been the effort by advocates for drug policy reform to move off of cannabis and move towards psychedelics. And again, there's a complicated medical backstory here. There have been FDA trials to see if psychedelics could be an effective treatment for a variety of mental health issues. And there still seems to be some excitement about therapeutic psychedelics. But even amidst uncertainty about that, Oregon in 2020, Colorado in 2022 had enacted through ballot initiatives the legalization of psychedelics as therapeutics in a variety of ways. And Massachusetts was going to be the next state to do that, or so the advocates hoped in 2024. However, in Massachusetts, a psychedelics legalization initiative got resoundingly rejected, lost by 14 points, which really surprised an awful lot of advocates. And that has contributed to this idea that voters said no to drugs in a notable number because all these marijuana and the psychedelic ballot initiative also failed. One last part of that kind of political conversation had to do with a California proposition, Proposition 36, which wasn't about legalization specifically, but was about recriminalizing at the felony level drug distribution. In a ballot initiative about a dozen years ago, Californians had actually reduced to misdemeanor status a variety of theft and drug crimes. And there's been lots of conversation about that leading to disorder, shoplifting on the theft side, more open air drug markets on that side of things. And California voters, by a remarkable margin, 70-30, voted for Prop 36, which would refelonize drug offenses under certain circumstances, though it also provides for treatment. And it's a little bit more nuanced than just a full rejection of prior drug reforms. And so you've got a narrative that a number of major papers and other advocates have really emphasized, that we saw a real turning away from the drug policy liberalization that really had marked recent election cycles. Where that will go, how advocates all around these issues will respond, remains to be seen. But it's one of the things that those of us at a place like the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, where we're really trying to get an eye on how criminal justice norms are changing and how policy norms are changing. It's a very interesting data point. After there had been such support for a range of liberalizing reforms, really across the country in prior elections.
Doug, thanks so much for that overview. I want to specifically come back to you in a minute on cannabis, but Jim, we know the norms and how some of these drugs are perceived. Specifically want to talk about cannabis. So we see some of the state laws are changing, but campus policies aren't changing because of federal policy. And please share personal experience in California.
The Drug-Free Schools and Community Act is a federal law, and it puts in jeopardy all federal funds that universities receive if they're not in compliance with it. And that says that you will prohibit illegal drugs on your campus or associated with your campus activities, and you'll enforce that. And at the federal level, cannabis remains an illegal substance, Schedule 1. Even if it goes to Schedule 3, it would still be a scheduled substance and can't just be used out on your quad. And so all of the universities and colleges that I know of have interpreted the laws this way and have continued to prohibit cannabis on their campuses. Even if there is a shop that is selling across the street, you can't have it on your campus or associated with campus activities, nor can you promote it. So that hasn't changed this whole time. It was clear all along that did not change policy on college campuses. It obviously could change if there is a change in the scheduling in terms of it's descheduled or if it's made legal at a federal level. If it goes to the states, then it'll be up to the states, and the campus would have to follow the state laws associated with it. In terms of the prevention, we've learned a lot more about what cannabis does to the college student, if you want to put it that way. First of all, college students have always had seemingly pretty easy access to cannabis. So there was not a huge spike in use patterns among typical college age, 18 to 24-year-olds. You were seeing changes in some of the demographics other than college age starting to use more. But you do see more regular use, daily use, or near daily use. That has spiked amongst college students. And we've also learned more about the impact that has on academic success. Not too surprisingly, it ends up harming academic success amongst those who use it, and also even just enrollment continuity, dropping out or leaving and then coming back and struggling finishing your degree in a timely manner. And students are reporting in surveys that go out, like the NCHA, that they will admit that cannabis has made them miss an assignment or do worse on a test. So that's something we've learned and something that is important. The other component that we've learned is that impaired driving is a serious issue amongst our demographic that we serve in most universities. Impaired driving around alcohol has always been the number one cause of alcohol-related deaths. We don't have similar statistics to give us a sense of what sort of impact cannabis-impaired driving is on college students in the same way we do with alcohol. But we do know that states are reporting more and more that cannabis is within the system of people who have crashed and there has been a fatality. That has gone up quite a bit as well. And a lot of times it's alcohol and cannabis that is on board with the drivers. So these are things that we've learned and things that we've had to adjust our programming, or we're starting to adjust our programming around, so that we're talking to students about the frequency of use, not necessarily the use itself, and the impact it may be having on their academics. And then also developing programs around impaired driving for cannabis.
Thank you for talking about rescheduling. Doug, I want to come to you with that. But first, I want to highlight, you shared an acronym, NCHA, for listeners. That is the National College Health Assessment. So it is the survey from the American College Health Association that campuses can license from them, and then to get data specific on their campus. Jim, you did mention the scheduling of cannabis, and I know that's kind of been top of mind. Doug, I would love to hear your thoughts on what we might be able to expect with this administration.
So I'm tempted to say expect the unexpected, and that's partially because that's kind of the nature of politics generally, but I think especially when it comes to the issue specifically of cannabis scheduling under current federal law and the developments we've already seen, which I'll talk about in a minute, it's just very hard to map out either a timeline, or an outcome, especially because litigation is all but inevitable. And I think that's one of the things that I would sort of emphasize to anybody trying to sort of figure out what to make of the ongoing and now perhaps even more uncertain effort to reschedule at the federal level. And let me provide a little background. Folks may be familiar with this, but I'll try to do it quickly because there's lots to it. Cannabis is fully prohibited under federal law, in part because it is listed under the Controlled Substances Act as a Schedule 1 drug, which means no medical value and high potential for abuse. That's long been criticized, long been the subject of litigation, long been a point of discourse, especially as medical marijuana applications have been explored in various ways. But it hasn't moved administratively, nor has Congress seen fit to move forward with any bills that could, through legislation, change its scheduling. That, among other things, was a big talking point before the 2020 election, where an awful lot of Democratic candidates in their primary and leading up to that election were talking about the need to deschedule or reschedule. But even though the Democrats had control of both houses of Congress and the presidency from 2021 for the next 2 years, nothing happened other than some bills and lots of discussion until then President Biden in October 2022 issued some blanket clemencies and then also instructed his agencies to look into rescheduling. And he didn't script that other than to say he thought it was wrong that marijuana is treated like LSD and heroin on Schedule 1 and left it to the various agencies that's involved in the process of scheduling or rescheduling. That is the usual alphabet soup of federal agencies. In this context specifically, HHS is tasked with kind of doing the science, and then they make a recommendation to DEA, which is part of DOJ, to then sort of finalize any recommended reforms. What we had happen in the 2023-24 period was HHS recommending that cannabis move from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And that was controversial from everybody's perspective. Folks who are troubled by cannabis reform said it shouldn't move out of Schedule 1. It's still appropriate as a Schedule 1 drug. Most advocates for cannabis reform want it to be completely descheduled, to be treated the same way as tobacco and alcohol, both of which are clearly dangerous and harmful drugs, but for political reasons have been completely off the Controlled Substances Act. And so you might say, well, Schedule 3 must be right if everybody hates the idea of Schedule 3, but that's where sort of things stood as the administrative process went forward. And there were some reports of contention even among the various agencies about whether that was the appropriate landing spot. Interestingly, in the run-up to the election, then candidate Donald Trump indicated his support for having cannabis move to Schedule 3. That may have been, like a lot of things that he did, purely with politics in mind rather than with a deep vision of policy, but I still think it's important that he's on record supporting the move to Schedule 3. Among the very kind of legalistic but fascinating underbellies of this is probably under the old internal rules that the agencies in charge of this use, cannabis shouldn't be rescheduled, but HHS adopted what might be deemed kind of a new approach, very much relying on the fact that so many states had authorized medical marijuana to justify the move to Schedule 3. That's one of the many reasons that I think litigation is inevitable, because of the legal standards for this decision-making is so much up in the air, and because cannabis policy is subject to so much debatability, both as a matter of science and as a matter of how you judge that science. And so even if we had a consistent Democratic administration, I wouldn't say it was a given that we were going to see this move to Schedule 3. There was every reason to expect that a Biden Justice Department would be supportive in some respects of the rescheduling. Whether a new Trump Justice Department will be remains to be seen. And just to round all this out, the litigation that will take place may ultimately be the decider. Ultimately, it may get in front of courts. I could even imagine this going all the way up to the Supreme Court. Whatever the agencies decide, there will be folks contesting that choice in light of the Controlled Substances Act language and the contestable evidence around that. That means I actually think we're just going to have the status quo for at least a couple of years. And when all is said and done, and I think this is what is most interesting to imagine, Congress is the only one who can probably cut through this in some significant way. And there may be some folks who would think now that both the House and the Senate are controlled by Republicans, that there's no chance that cannabis policy will move forward through Congress. But again, that's a certain uncertainty. There are banking regulations that an awful lot of folks on the right have supported to allow the state cannabis industry to function more like regular businesses. There's also possibly the view that by moving this to Schedule 3, you actually thwart, or at least are in a position to thwart, state legalization, because the move to Schedule 3 doesn't make it legal anywhere. It puts it under the auspices of a more sort of traditional prescription medicine. And there may be many folks who would be inclined to say that's the right way to treat this. There shouldn't be this sort of state by state legalization marketplace, there should be more traditional medical marketplaces, run more like traditional prescription medicine. And so I don't know exactly what to expect, except, the unexpected and possibly other political twists and turns at the federal level.
I wanted to really quickly clarify, Doug. So rescheduling, is any drug that is scheduled under the Controlled Substances Act considered illegal?
Every drug under the Controlled Substances Act is, as the name suggests, controlled according to federal law. Now, the nature of the control depends on where it is in the schedule. And this is an important point, and Jim actually mentioned research earlier about what we're learning about cannabis use and the like. And I think the strongest argument, though of course not the argument that drives where a drug ends up on the schedule, is that cannabis being on Schedule 1 for so many years really hindered significant research about the drug and so many aspects of the drug. And in fact, that led last year to the passage of a marijuana research bill that was signed off by President Biden and had really bipartisan support, because everybody recognizes the horse is out of the barn in terms of cannabis use, and we really need to catch up with research. But every different component of the schedule has different degrees of control. Generally speaking, and Schedule 3 is where I'll kind of lean into it, because that's the proposal on the table. It still means you'd need to have a doctor's prescription. Schedule 2 drugs are a good example, opioids being the most classic example. Most opioids are not Schedule 1, other than heroin. There are other places on the schedule. In fact, I believe there is an opioid-related drug on every one of the schedules. Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5, based in potency, based in the way in which it's packaged. And so the scheduling per se just determines how controlled it is under federal law. And if you do it absent the proper controls, that's still a crime, right? So if you're manufacturing and selling illicit versions of opioid, fentanyl, you name it, even though that's a Schedule 2 drug, you're in as much trouble as if you're doing it with a Schedule 1 drug. Same will be true for Schedule 3, again, assuming there's an interest in enforcing. And that's where at the cannabis part of the equation, we've had not just these significant state level reforms, but we've had variety of federal officials, formally and informally, showing very little interest in enforcing federal cannabis law on top of state cannabis law, except under some extreme trafficking circumstances. Of course, that was always true, right? I mean, this goes back to the, I won't call out Jim as old, or me as well, but in the 60s and 70s, there was an extraordinary amount of cannabis use taking place on college campuses, and yet there was very little enforcement because of an understanding that that was a poor use of state and federal resources, even though it was then illegal under both state law and federal law. There was still some enforcement going on, but we know this is true for all drugs, not just cannabis, that the amount of criminal enforcement is relatively limited, particularly for use, as opposed to the broad spectrum of who's using. And so the details of what happens to enforcement when we switch schedule status is much more about how does that change our interest in enforcement of illegality and who's doing what kind of pattern activity than it does specifically with, what's the new law now once we've shifted schedules.
Yeah, so this might actually be a good time to point out, because you've said cannabis, marijuana, cannabis, and to the average person, I think that they conflate the two as the same thing, but structurally and, in terms of the plant, it's not the same thing. So Logan, I know that you and I, in preparing for this conversation, this is a big topic, right, with campuses?
Yeah, and as Jim knows, in our work at the Higher Ed Center, there's so many products that fall under that aren't necessarily scheduled because of the CBD products or Delta 8, which is a different strand of THC. And so, Jim, let's go to you of what we're hearing from campuses about products that are in the area or arena of cannabis, marijuana, but don't necessarily fall under the scheduling piece and are legal, in quotes, is what I'll use, because you could go buy them at a gas station or another shop not far from campus.
That is a concern that we keep hearing from campuses, and it makes sense that they're concerned, because these products, not only can they just be bought in convenience stores or whatnot, it really is a gray area of whether or not your current policies on campus conform in a way that would prohibit those. And that is troublesome. And we also don't know much about them. We don't even know much about the packaging and the processing. So it may contain, Delta 8 or something that skirts the current law, but it also may contain other things. A few years ago, just before COVID, we were very concerned about vape pens that were being purchased, not cannabis-related ones. These were tobacco ones or nicotine ones. And they had vitamin E in it. It took a while to figure out what was going on, but these young, mostly men, were going to the hospital and dying from lung problems that just made no sense. And it turned out that basically these vape pens were being manufactured in a garage, and they looked well branded. And so they looked legit, and there's no regulation. There was no oversight on what can be in these products. And this is the same issue when you have regulation. The states have put in for dispensaries certain things for THC, Delta 9 related, the cannabis plant. And the safety element presumably is much higher if you're getting it in a licensed dispensary that has some level of regulation. But these other products are not. They are just in a gas station. So it's not just the active ingredient that's a concern. It's the whole process of manufacturing and use. And we're not at a place where I think we've handled that particular topic on most campuses.
Doug, this is very, very timely because DEPIC just dropped a report called Considerations for Regulating Intoxicating Hemp in Ohio. And we have a resource page on the Drug Enforcement Policy Center's website. But you want to go ahead and just kind of give an overview of what that report says and maybe provide some more context to break down Delta 9 versus Delta 8 and then some of the other pieces of the report that I found very informative, because you hear about hemp and for some reason in my mind, I'm like, ooh, it's hemp. It's not weed, but it's healthy. But as Jim pointed out, it's not regulated. You don't know what you're getting. You don't know what types of products are synthetic. There's not a lot of studies around, consumption of these products. And then there's also considerations for how to talk to students or talk to the general public about the consumption of these products. So I'll let you go ahead and take it from there.
I could, as is my nature, go on and on for hours on this topic because it's both fascinating as another example of expect the unexpected and the way in which lawyers have an ability to screw up the world. And I'll give both of that because this all flows from a piece of federal legislation, actually, that was signed into law by President Trump back in 2018 as part of what's generally known as the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a bill that passes every 5 or 6 years to kind of reset farm policy in the country. And usually it's not that controversial. This one proved so because as part of the 2018 Farm Bill, there was an effort largely as a result, I sense, of concern among tobacco farmers and others in that space that crop was drying up as a possible resource. And that was a real problem for farmers there. And so there was a big push to say, hey, what about this thing called hemp? Hemp is just another label for the cannabis plant, but typically used to describe the cannabis plant with very low levels, almost microscopic amounts of the THC intoxicant. And so the thought was if the federal law passed a bill that said, we'll say you can grow hemp as long as it has less than 0.3% of Delta 9 THC. And Delta 9 is the shorthand version of the long chemical name I can't give you. That's what everybody thought about at that time that's the intoxicating part of the cannabis plant, the Delta 9 THC. And so grow the plant with less than, a very small amount. And that's regular hemp. And we'll use that for rope and fiber and all sorts of other purposes. The thought also was, you may all recall, back then CBD was becoming a popular supplement, and that's another cannabinoid that doesn't make you high from the cannabis plant. And it was looking kind of bad that there were all these CBD products out there that may not be legal, probably weren't legal at the time. We can legalize that, and we'll give hemp farmers or farmers who want to grow hemp a real great opportunity to take advantage of a new crop and a new economic way to turn their crops around. The problem was an extraordinary amount of hemp was grown, and nobody wanted hemp fibers quite that much as everybody hoped. And so there was this extraordinary glut of hemp. And then some, I don't know if they're creative or conniving producers figured out, there are other cannabinoids that can get you high in the plant. Delta 8, very similar to Delta 9. There's also Delta 10. There's something called THCO and THCA, all sorts of variations that are intoxicating. And if we take all this hemp that's sort of sitting around being unbought and combine synthetically the very small amounts, but still not insignificant amounts of these other intoxicants into products, we have something that we think is legal, say these manufacturers, because technically it seems as though it is. And a number of courts have now said, yeah, Congress said only this stuff's marijuana, this other stuff is legal. We can create this whole side market, in a sense, of intoxicating hemp products where there's no regulations. There's really no manufacturing standards. Jim mentioned this. You can do anything you want to synthesize it. You can put it in packaging that would be sold at gas stations. You can sell it to kids. Governor DeWine here in Ohio had his public safety directors have some 15-year-olds go into a gas station to buy these products. And their point wasn't, oh, look how terrible it is that this gas station is selling this product. Their point was, that's perfectly legal under existing law. We need to regulate these products that have fallen into this legal gray area that clearly could be dangerous. We don't know much about them. And that's been a talking point here in Ohio and in every other state, whether there should be an effort to completely prohibit these products at the state level. There's been talk at the federal level to fix this loophole in existing federal law. And then what we've done in this report, among other things, to really piggyback off what Jim was talking about, is highlight just how many really elaborate regulations we currently have for marijuana sold through our legal regulated market, and how none of that applies to the Delta-8 or intoxicating hemp market. And so it is quite concerning. I think especially what I've heard from my students, and I don't know if others on college campuses are hearing this, is there's kind of this reputation that Delta-8 and other intoxicating hemps are kind of like diet weed, somehow like less potent and less dangerous potentially than traditional marijuana. And I don't think there's any real evidence to bear that out, other than sometimes these products are made with lower potency levels just because it's harder to manufacture the products to be as potent as traditional marijuana has grown in various settings. And so it may be that not just these are less clear and less regulated products, but that there's a reputation that they're less dangerous when there's really no foundation for that view. And so in Ohio, we're going to see some movement. Probably a number of you who are in other states have heard of developments just about every state. Interesting here, last thing to sort of highlight just from a market perspective, often it's the legal marijuana industry that's so eager to make sure these products get regulated and are subject maybe even to prohibitions because they don't like the competition. A particular example here relates to selling near schools. Here in Ohio, you can't have a legal cannabis dispensary within 500 feet of a school or a church or a playground. There's nothing prohibiting having your gas station that close that sells these Delta-8 products. And in fact, there's some evidence to suggest some of these smoke shops and others are going out of their way to set up camp near college campuses, near schools, because they know young people are a target market. And so I think it's a real challenge for states on a regulatory front, and I think we'll continue to see efforts to kind of rein in this space, though, whether and how that then leads to its own set of unexpected developments remains to be seen.
I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit from this wild, wild west of intoxicating hemp and back to student consumption of substances. It doesn't matter if they live in a state where weed is legal. If it's federally illegal and campuses have to abide by federal law and be compliant, then we're just operating in a space where abstinence is the day. But at the same time, we're talking about prevention and recovery because students are still going to use. But we know in the general population, consumption trends differ depending on the population, whether it be age or race. And so also, kind of playing into this, we've got campuses that even though you abide by federal law, the fact that you have prevention and recovery and then also enforcement practices, whatever those mechanisms may be for enforcement, I imagine it's a little bit different from just your average policed community with, your traditional law enforcement. But my question is, do you see any trends in terms of who is getting sanctioned on campuses and for what types of substances? Is there a major difference? Because there's definitely a difference in the quote unquote real world, but in the bubble of higher ed, what are you seeing in terms of, racial disparities or just communities and what they're consuming or not consuming, where they consume and who picks them up? I would love to hear a little bit more from Jim about that.
When you look at most enforcement on a college campus, the enforcement, it comes from the sort of highest touch component of a campus, which is residence halls. So it's within residence halls, and therefore it's the RAs or other people who sort of supervise residence halls that is the bulk of alcohol, drug-related, whatever. That's where you'll see it. And alcohol is definitely king in here. So that's where you'll see most. of the violations by far. And when you're talking about enforcement, it doesn't necessarily mean being charged criminally. It's more of an administrative component of the campus where they may be on some sort of sanction of if it happens again, something else will happen, a step kind of wise. It could be sending to a program like Basics, which is a brief intervention program that is based on some really nice research that shows that it will reduce the problems that someone may end up having around alcohol. There's similar ones for cannabis as well. So it is a bit more of a treatment approach for a lot of campuses, but not like a heavy duty treatment that you might think of when you say treatment focus. More campuses are having recovery communities and recovery programs as well. And so there is recognition that there are students who benefit from those types of programs, regardless of the substance that's involved. The other place you'll often find if a campus has a Greek community, then there'll be maybe some social activities that end up spurring police action, because those are usually off campus. And so now you're in the community, and it might be the campus police that are involved. It might be the city police that are involved. And that's where it could end up being more of a criminal component versus an administrative component that the campus has. Or if it's in a Greek community, it might be both. A lot of campuses are moving in the direction of having amnesty policies. It predates the fentanyl poisoning crisis that's been involved, but it's picked up a lot of steam so that fraternities, sororities, whoever will not face the same level of sanctions if they call for an ambulance, if someone has overdosed on alcohol or another drug. And so that's a change that we're definitely seeing more and more campuses adopt. Previously, it was reaction to alcohol-related deaths, but with the spike of fentanyl and opioid deaths, it's really moved things along. Those are the things we see the most. You also will see things in some of our surveys. And that's where you'll find that, first of all, most students aren't using cannabis. By far, most students are using cannabis. And if they have used cannabis, it's once at some point in their life. So you have this misperception of the norms often, both amongst the administration, but also amongst the students. And so it is important that when we talk about any of these behaviors and substances, we acknowledge that even with binge drinking, for almost every university, it's a minority of students who are engaged in that type of behavior. But from the student's perspective, they'll say everyone's doing it. And so that's important. And that exists also in the cannabis world.
I just want to go ahead and thank Doug for agreeing to be in the hot seat and Jim for agreeing to subject himself to my line of questioning on this area. As someone who was a college student, definitely attended parties, may or may not have consumed something I should not have consumed while a college student. I think that the work you guys are doing is very important. There's definitely so much still to be learned from this space. And I'm really interested to see how things develop with intoxicating hemp, how that affects your work. So, Doug, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to give?
Hannah kind of described your world as a bubble, and I certainly think about that, even though I live and work in it to the extent that I'm on a big college campus. But there's so much going on, and obviously the population of students in particular are exactly at the ages that an awful lot of policymakers and a lot of folks concerned about enforcement across a number of dimensions are always focused on, and yet I'm not sure always as informed as they need to be. And so we'd really appreciate if you have particular topics or thoughts you could like to share with us, that you feel free to do so. And please, if anything comes up in your work, don't be afraid to let us know.
Well, thanks again, Jim. And thank you, Logan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us a part of the conversation. We really appreciate it.
Drugs on the Docket is a production of the Moritz College of Law Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. This episode is produced by me, Hannah Miller, and Holly Griffin. Doug Berman is our editorial advisor. The music is composed by Joe DeWitt.